It's pretty common knowledge at this point that if you had to pick a publisher that was the embodiment of everything that's evil and wrong in this industry right now, Activision would win hands down. Most of their current lineup is licensed movie games, and what isn't a licensed movie game tends to have the letters COD somewhere in the title. They have a strongly entrenched anti-creativity bent, exemplified when Infinity Ward had to fight tooth and nail just to set the fourth Call of Duty in a modern setting. Their corporate partnership with Blizzard just seems to be slowly turning one of the last great independent AAA studios into a company that just wants to monetize user content, when it decides to let users share content at all. Bobby Kotick has gone out of his way to treat games as boxed product rather than a creative medium, saying he wants to take all the fun out of development and shoveling sequel after sequel down people's throats until the franchise dies. So yes, in 2011, Activision embodies most of what's wrong with the games industry, but there was a time, from about 1999 to 2006 or so, that EA was seen as the big bad. This has its roots in a lot of places. There were the early installments of Madden that never seemed to bring substantive changes to the franchise, and really that could be said for just about any of their sports games. They also purchased that exclusive lock on NFL rights that basically killed all other football games on the market, meaning there was no real competition from other publishers and there was no motivation for EA to improve themselves. They also had a tendency to make those awful schlocky movie shovelware titles. Remember those awful James Bond games from the early 2000s? Have you played any of the Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings games? But the biggest reason for all of the EA hate? Acquisition and liquidation of developers on a massive scale. Some of the best developers of the 90s were bought up and either quietly dissolved or turned into sequel farms, giving EA access to all of their great properties, but with none of the talent that made those companies originally so great. In their honor, let's have a moment of silence to remember the fallen. Then around 2007, something happened. I don't know if it was a result of shareholder pressure, or if having Larry Probst take over as CEO from John Riccitiello had anything to do with it, or if the company was just sick of doing the same thing over and over again. Well, whatever the cause, EA began releasing a torrent of new franchises. In the 3 years between 2007 and 2009, we saw the arrival of Dead Space, Army of Two, Mass Effect, Rock Band, Boom Blocks, Brutal Legend, Skate, Spore, Dragon Age, and The Saboteur. Compare that to, say, 2004, when their list was basically just a bunch of sports sequels, a bunch of licensed junk, and your annual Battlefield, Burnout, and Medal of Honor releases. I mean, this is a company that was renowned for being creatively bankrupt, for swallowing developers whole and forcing them to spit out yearly sequels or expansion packs. They were the Activision of their time. Granted, that time was only 4 or 5 years ago, but still, the point stands. And here they were releasing an explosion of new games, some of them even risky games. And nothing exemplifies that little experiment more, for better and for worse, than Mirror's Edge. Being released in the middle of what might be called EA's fertile years, Mirror's Edge was an experiment in first-person platforming. Traditionally in game design, this is seen as a very bad thing. The first-person perspective means that you don't really have a frame of reference for precisely where you are relative to the edge of a platform, making those really tight Mario-style jumps that are the showpiece of a good platformer difficult at best and infuriatingly tricky at worst. Jumping on a Goomba or timing that perfect jump is hard enough when you know exactly where your character is. Adding the ambiguity of a limited perspective only serves to hassle the player. Conventional wisdom said that the game would be doomed. But DICE weren't interested in the type of platformer that traditionally defined the genre. They were after something else altogether. In the mid-2000s, parkour exploded on the scene, and before it was known for James Bond movies and bad commercials, it was known primarily as an expressive, physical, kinetic art in motion where efficacy was elegance. It wasn't about making the biggest or most complicated jumps, it was about traversing an arbitrary and complex landscape in the shortest way possible, and making that difficult transition seem effortless. This is what DICE were after. Not a first-person Mario game, but a game about the sense of physicality and momentum that parkour provides. This is why the game had to be in first person, to convey directly to the player that sense of movement. It's less about pixel-perfect jumps and more about a sense of momentum and flow.
Runners see the city in a different way. We see the flow. Rooftops become pathways and conduits, possibilities, and routes to escape. The flow is what keeps us running, keeps us alive.
And the best part is, they succeeded. Mostly. The game is at its best when you're given free rein to tackle obstacles in different ways, especially areas with an emphasis on jumping, ducking, and wall running. The game becomes a free-form, first-person version of Cannibal, where you absolutely feel every push, tuck, and roll. The sense of momentum and earned speed, and of overcoming your surroundings, is something that, quite frankly, has yet to be replicated in any other game. The only flaw in the game's platforming is that there are some mechanics that don't really flow into one another as well as others. There's just not much to climbing up or down a pipe, really. You can climb up the pipe, and you can climb down the pipe. Same thing with hanging from ledges. You can't really transition from a wall run to a ledge hang without feeling like you've lost absolutely all of that precious momentum. These mechanics feel sort of like playing a Tony Hawk game where periodically you're forced to get off your skateboard and climb a ladder. You're going from chaining wonderful, skill-based moves together to boring translation along a one-dimensional line. That said, they do have one really good utility: punctuating the otherwise relentless jumps, leaps, dives, and rolls the player has to take. 10 seconds climbing straight up a pipe might be boring, but it's 10 seconds to catch your breath in the middle of a time trial or fast-paced chase. DICE managed to achieve their vision of a parkour game, but there's no doubt it took lots of prototyping and playtesting to get it there. And lots of prototypes means lots of formal submissions to corporate for approval. Unfortunately, this is still EA we're talking about. Fertile period or not, their middle managers think like business analysts and not artists, and they didn't think that audiences would dig a first-person game where all you did is run around. So, periodically the game feels the need to hand-feed you shooty bits. Now, DICE claims that they had shooty bits in the game from day one, and even if that's the case, they clearly weren't really a priority. The gunplay is generic, loose, and flaccid, and worse, it completely interrupts the sense of flow that's so vital to this game's success. Faith doesn't pop off a few rounds to provide covering fire while wall jumping out of harm's way. No, they force the game to grind to a halt while one 110-pound girl takes on 4 armed guys with firearms, because people wouldn't buy the thing if you couldn't beat the shit out of someone, apparently. These confrontations are actually baked into the level design. You will repeatedly turn around a corner to an open room full of enemies with no immediate exit or proper path. This isn't because DICE doesn't know how to design a good obstacle course with clear goals. Most of the game is nothing but a good obstacle course. No, these open rooms exist specifically to confuse you. Without a proper path, you can't simply run by the guards like you normally would, and as a result, you're forced to take out SWAT team members instead of avoiding them. These are easily the worst part of the game, and while their inclusion frustrates me to no end, it was something that really wasn't avoidable. This is what I mean when I say that the game highlights both the best and worst of a game publisher trying new things. Mirror's Edge wouldn't exist without EA willing to take some chances, on a new IP, on a new set of game mechanics, on a highly stylized visual aesthetic. But while publishers, good publishers anyway, see the benefit in taking risks for business reasons, they're not artists. They're not taking these risks because of a single cohesive vision, or the desire to bring something new and beautiful to the people, or to push the medium beyond its current limitations. They're doing it to refresh their brands and establish new IPs to exploit, and as a result, there are limits to the sort of risks they're willing to fund. The thinking at EA's middle management was surely this: Mirror's Edge can have its risky, exciting platforming mechanics as long as there's still enough shooty bits where we can pass it off as a traditional FPS game. And even though every inspired mechanic that's in the game that's worth a damn is about running and jumping, they could still market it as an action title. The trailer sees Faith dodging bullets.
They wiped away all the grittiness and humanity that the city ever had. I'm going to show them that they missed a spot.
And then there's the concept art, which features Faith holding guns and beating up SWAT team members. There's a very real sense that DICE saw this game as a visceral, free-running experience, while EA saw it as a traditional FPS with some cutesy experimental movement mechanics. This is how publishers think. They don't know how to sell a game they haven't sold before. Oh, a game about parkour? Okay. What's the audience for that? What demographics does it resonate with? What ad agency do we hire to sell to that demographic? What channels do we advertise on? If we're really aiming this at 18 to 34-year-old males, why can't we make Faith a little bustier? Is there any way we can try to emphasize the fact that there is shooting in this game? At no point does this giant game-making machine stop and think about what's best for the game and how to bend marketing and design in service of the game itself. Instead, it just laments the fact that the game isn't easier to sell to people. The rest of the experiment is largely hit and miss and generally not as solid as the core gameplay mechanics. Faith, for example, is actually a cool character in her design. You don't get many sprightly, tiny Asian women as protagonists in action games. Certainly not by Western developers. But there's not much to her or the universe she inhabits.
The changes came slowly at first. Most didn't realize, or didn't care, and accepted them. They chose a comfortable life. Some didn't. And those who refused to conform were pushed to the sidelines, criminalized. They became our clients. We call ourselves runners. We exist on the edge, between the gloss and the reality, the mirror's edge.
So Faith is a courier for the underground organization that attempts to topple the authoritarian regime that established a dystopian peace on the city. Sounds like a really cool premise. Shame they didn't do anything with it. Seriously, after the prologue level, you never complete a single run for the underground, and in that level, you passed your package off to another runner before you even opened it up.
Okay, I got it from here.
Okay, they're playing rough cell.
You never go to the ruined parts of the city or meet any members of the underground in this game. Actually, you never really see any civilians at all. It's like an entire city filled with nothing but SWAT teams and parkour artists in a never-ending game of cops and runners. This renders the little vestiges of this plot that are left totally ineffectual. Why is this evil government evil again? What are the demands of the underground, and what are their plans in taking back the city? Mirror's Edge doesn't care to answer those questions. Instead, the very first level of the game kicks off what is essentially a film noir plot. A famous politician has been murdered, and Faith's sister Kate has been framed. Faith spends the whole game running from rooftop to rooftop looking for answers to unravel this mystery, free her sister, and solve the whodunit, and it just doesn't work. This whole universe is set up to be a post-9/11 commentary on the emergence of a police state, and instead they're trying to tell us about Philip Marlowe and the Maltese Falcon. It's like trying to use George Orwell's 1984 universe to tell a spaghetti western story about a new sheriff in town. It doesn't make any sense. The game is bold, visually speaking, with a washed-out cityscape punctuated by chunks of intense primary colors. But since we never see the scraggly, burnt-out underground that supposedly exists, it just becomes an empty, if really cool-looking, aesthetic decision. What was chosen at some point in the development of the game because it symbolized the forced order and false cleanliness of an authoritarian state becomes just an abstract, cool-looking city design. Maybe future games in the franchise can show us that underground. Make Mirror's Edge a game about people who actually do inhabit this flimsy space between two worlds. The good news is that the hard part is just getting the first game in a new IP out the door. Now that they have a base for the franchise, they can build upon what's been established. Flesh out Faith's world, maybe even put some actual citizens in it. They can iterate and improve on the free running, and maybe remove the gunplay entirely now that we're comfortable with the idea of a first-person platformer. After all, they had said that this was the first in a planned trilogy of games to tell Faith's entire story. But then something big happened. Something EA could only see coming in retrospect. Something that would eclipse all other development priorities for major publishers from 2007 onwards. Something loud, big, stupid, and exploding. Ah yes, the ongoing shooter war pissing match. In the early 2000s, and well before Mirror's Edge, DICE had released World War II shooter Battlefield 1942, and followed that up in 2005 with Battlefield 2. The latter was a multiplayer-focused shooter set in modern times with unlockable weapons and awards. In 2007, Activision released the original Modern Warfare, also a game about modern combat with weapon unlocks and awards, except Modern Warfare made hundreds of millions of dollars. EA wanted a piece of that pie. DICE were a natural choice to draft a competing product, and Mirror's Edge did okay, but it didn't exactly burn up the sales charts. So plans for sequels were mostly scrapped in favor of who needs new IPs and experimental gameplay? There's $500 million a year on the line! This is really the sad lesson EA learned from its little foray into cultivating a batch of new experimental IPs. They're great for your image. EA really does look better now than it did in 2005. They can push the medium forward in new ways. They can attract a new audience. But you're never going to earn as much money in the short term from new IPs as you can from highly polished sequels to a known brand name. Ultimately, it's more profitable to do something popular than to do something good. I'm afraid the lesson EA learned from making these experimental new games, Mirror's Edge, Brutal Legend, Spore, what have you, is that you have to make a choice between your product and your shareholders. Most of these games didn't recoup their money, or at least didn't generate large enough returns to justify not chasing down the Call of Duty millions. And you can see EA's gear shift right around 2010 with the release of Medal of Honor, DICE's first attempt to take on Call of Duty. The lesson here is one of balance. EA was never going to achieve enormous profits pouring a ton of money into risky creative new ventures. They're risky and creative. Some will resonate with audiences more than others. But the answer isn't to find the 3 that make you the most money and run them into the ground, either. Even when compromised by corporate interests, titles that try new things really do push the medium forward. I mean, without Mirror's Edge, I doubt we'd see the recently released indie platformer In Momentum. It, too, is a first-person game with an emphasis on movement and spatial traversal through environments with bold primary colors. The influence is apparent, and to inspire new developers with a fresh vision, or to prove that old design rules can be broken, these are critically important things for a game company to do. I'd go so far as to say they're the responsibility of any developer or publisher with wealth or power. The critical step is, and always has been, recognizing that games are a creative medium first and something you shill to appease stockholders second. If you ignore that, you run the risk of becoming EA circa 2000 or Activision today.